I had a blissfully happy and so somewhat privileged childhood. My father was a very eminent lawyer in Amsterdam. And I certainly remember when the Germans invaded Holland. It was very exciting, you know. I was only sort of 5, 6 years old. And to see these soldiers marching down the streets with their greatcoats on and their rucksacks on their backs and their gun, you know, their rifles over their shoulders and the scabbards in the belt, marching down the street. Yes, that was very exciting, very interesting, you know, for a child. We had no idea of the sort of sinister intentions that were about to occur.
Being such a young age, such 5 or 6, when you were first taken, how did you feel? Were you able to comprehend what was actually happening at the time?
Well, it was a very slow way. The Germans turned the screw very, very slowly. Suddenly we weren't allowed to go into the local park to play anymore. You know, my friends in the street where I lived could go in to play. I couldn't because there was a notice on the gate that said for Juden verboten, for Jews forbidden. And suddenly I was this thing called a Jew. I didn't know what it meant. We were secular. You know, we were a secular family. We were basically Dutch who just happened to be Jewish, not Catholic or Protestant or anything else. And I couldn't understand why being a Jew wouldn't allow me to go and play in the park. And then we weren't allowed to go to the zoo, and we weren't allowed to go to restaurants, well, not so much for children, but, you know, for the adults. And then we were banned from using public transport, and you weren't allowed to use a bike. And our radio was confiscated and our telephone was cut off. You know, you became aware that we were being slowly but surely isolated, completely isolated.
What were you able to do with your free time then, or what did you find to be able to do in such conditions?
We still played with our friends. You know, we never came. You know, so many times you hear, you know, your friends who were at school suddenly turned on you, said you're a dirty Jew or something like that, you know, and spat at you. We had nothing like that in Holland. My friends continue to remain my friends. It made absolutely no difference to them whatsoever. Only, of course, when we went into the park, I couldn't go in there with them. That was all. And they would know that I was Jewish and couldn't go in. But my friends remained my friends.
Where were you first taken to when you were taken away, and do you remember the day that it was?
Oh yes,
what happened on the day?
It was quite interesting. Because what happened was my father, he worked in the Dutch resistance and was betrayed when he was imprisoned in a prison called Amersfoort. And whilst he was there, 3 of his friends, who were not Jewish, but were all married with their own children, petitioned the German authorities for clemency for my father, citing on a long list all the things he had done. He was a very humanitarian man. He'd done a lot of really good things for his fellow human beings. Of course, you're dealing with people who have a fanatical hatred of Jews, and then one that was in the Dutch resistance, you know, even worse sort of thing. Yet they petitioned the German authorities, and the Germans wouldn't relent as far as my father was concerned. But they allowed his wife and 3 sons to be put on several of these priority lists that they had in Holland. You've got to sort of, if you look at the sort of general scene, of the 140,000 Jews that were living in Holland when the Germans invaded, 110,000 were murdered. So there's a huge percentage. And in order to stop mass panic, you know, among the Jewish population, they promised all sorts of things. And we were promised that we were on this list called the Barneveld list, and that meant that we would not be sent to a work camp abroad. And that, of course, was a great relief because people were now being picked up and deported east. We knew that if we were in this group, that we would at least remain there. And everybody hoped that the war would not go on for very long, and then when it was all over, we could go back to our homes.
So what was it like where you were first taken to then, if it wasn't one of these working camps?
It was a castle that the Germans had requisitioned, and the people who were on this Barneveld list were basically what I would call the top echelons of Dutch Jewish society. So you had professors and doctors and composers and musicians and those sort of people. And I can clearly remember, you know, at that time I was learning my multiplication tables as we do when we were sort of, you know, 7 years old. And, you know, whereas normally one learns it by rote, you know, 1 7's a 7, 2 7's a 14, 3 7's a 21. We were being taught our tables by this professor of mathematics at one of the Dutch universities. And he couldn't understand why the hell we couldn't understand what he was talking about.
What was the most frightening or worst experience you ever faced in?
Well, in all the camps.
In all the camps.
I think the worst thing was I learned how to hate. I really did learn how to hate. You know, hatred is a force that's within us. We all have this. Fortunately, we all managed to keep it under control. But my goodness me, did we learn to hate. The only good German was a dead German as far as I was concerned when the war ended. And it took years and years and years to get this hatred out of your system, because until you can, and then you come to a sort of period when you have to start about thinking about forgiving. Can you forgive? Yes, I've come to forgive, but I'll never forget. And of course I can only forgive for myself. I can't forgive for all the ones that were murdered and all the ones that are still alive who still can't forgive. And they live with hatred in their hearts. But I don't. I've gone beyond that now. There is no room for hatred in my heart at all anymore.
How did you feel on the day that you were liberated, and who was it that liberated you?
We were liberated by the Russians. The day before, we had an inkling that we were going to be liberated because my mother, who worked in the camp hospital laundry, again, tremendous forethought on her part. So my mother was returning from the laundry, this would have been on the 8th of May, returning from the laundry when she was approached by some Russian prisoners of war. And by this time, anybody who was a prisoner was in our camp, because we were the last place to be liberated when the war came to an end. And they pleaded with my mother. They knew she was a native English speaker. My mother was born in Eastbourne, not far from here, and had married a Dutchman, so that's how we were in Holland. And they pleaded with her to go into their house that they had, and they took her into the attic of their house, and there they'd hidden a radio. Would you believe it? A radio. How they got it there, heavens only knows it. And they gave my mother a pencil and paper, and she wrote down, and what she heard was Winston Churchill speaking from the Cabinet War Room, so that at midnight that night, the war would be over. But here we are, about 6 o'clock in the afternoon, in Theresienstadt, under German occupation. What were the Germans going to do? Were they going to gas us all with these new gas chambers that they'd built there? The new Mark III, maximum put through, German engineering had got rid of the bottlenecks that they had in Auschwitz, and that sort of thing. Were they going to gas us all, or shoot us, or a mixture of both? And there was even the rumour that the camp had been dynamited. Were they just going to blow us all up? And so I think, certainly, my mother would have gone to bed fearful, and anybody else that she told that the war would end at midnight that night. And so the following morning, the Germans had disappeared and the Russian army came in. They didn't want to be there. No, they went straight through, because people were dying like flies. But as they went through, they threw up biscuits and bits of chocolate, and we who could, grovelled in the mud to try and get a piece to eat because we were so terribly hungry. And then the Red Cross took the camp over, and slowly but surely brought everything under control. And they would empty one of the great big barracks they had there, because Theresienstadt was an army town, before it was, and they would seal off all the windows and everything, and then they would fumigate the whole barrack. And of course what they used for that was Cyclone B. There was plenty of that about, the gas that murdered millions of my people, including my father and my grandmother.
Was there ever a time in one of the camps where you felt extremely close to death, or did you ever wish it upon yourself? In the last camp, in Theresienstadt, we were all close to death. The food was scarce. We were always terribly hungry. Disease was rampant within the camp. And certainly as that war was coming to an end, the whole system in the camp virtually broke down, and there was virtually nothing to eat. And you must remember, here we are today, what is it, the 25th of March, the Holocaust, Auschwitz was liberated on the 27th of January. Here we are, the 24th of March, and we're still in the thick of it all, and going to be right up till the beginning of May. And people were dying, mainly of typhus and of all the 101 other diseases that were rampant in the camp, and of course starvation as well. So one was always had this feeling, are we going to survive? Typhus is a bug, that when it bites you, you die, particularly when you're starving. And the only way to keep typhus at bay was to try and keep yourself as clean as possible. So my mother volunteered to work in the camp hospital laundry, which was absolutely seething with disease. But there was hot water, and when the authorities weren't looking, she would wash her children's clothes, and also she would wash adults' clothes and barter that for food, because I said,
we were so terribly hungry within this camp. That really was the way that that kept us alive, you know, that my mother, this wing that she had over us, protecting us. Right near the end of the war, I actually got mumps. Now, it's not a particularly debilitating illness today, but it was then, and I was unconscious for 3 days. Usually when you lose consciousness, you know, that's the end. But that came round. Why? I had to live.